And I'm honored to introduce our second book presenter today, Professor Huub Dijstelbloem, chairing the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Amsterdam and the Department also of Philosophy, who will present the book The Technopolitics of Border Control, published with MIT Press in 2021. Huub, please join us here, and also looking forward to the responses we'll have after this, and feel free to leave also your questions in the chat, but also the questions coming here from the room. So the floor is yours, Huub, for about 25 to 30 minutes. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Koen, for organizing this conference, and thank you all for staying with us under these warm, steamy circumstances. Much appreciated. Yeah, it's an enormous joy to be here, and so you see so many scholars again. I've met, I think, for the last time, even in Utrecht a couple of years ago. Sandra, Saskia, Miria, everybody else, Veronica. It's a huge pleasure, and it's also a bit of a reunion because, as a matter of fact, I started working on the relationship between migration and technology together with Albert Meijer. And in 2010, we published an edited volume about the migration machine, later on published in English as well. And Evelien Brouwer was part of that project as well. So the journey continues. And it's a huge pleasure to have you all here. Well, indeed, the occasion is this book published last year by MIT Press. But before I start, let's share a little bit of my background, because the specific approach I try to develop in this book, and one of the underlying aims of this book, is to connect different conceptual lines of thinking. You know, I myself was trained in philosophy of science and technology, and what I use from that is what they call mediation theory. Mediation theory studies the relations between humans and technologies in all kinds of ways. Political theory, of course, but also science and technology studies, mainly actor network theory, and from international relations, European studies, and the history of technology. I work a lot with what they call the material turn. The material turn, also developed in many fields and applied in many fields nowadays. In the history of technology, for instance, it was developed as a kind of alternative for thinking solely in terms of human agency and institutions. So instead, historians, to understand collaboration in Europe and the establishment of the European Union, for instance, turned towards the building of huge networks and infrastructures, railroads, airports, telephone networks, the internet, and so on and so forth, to see how technologies unite and divide people as well, and how much knowledge and expertise is involved in that process, and how, let's say, the political shaping of Europe is only one part of building a unity of states. Well, together with these approaches, I try to speak to the literature in migration studies, security studies, surveillance studies, human mobility studies. But I think the specific angle I take is different. My focus is specifically on the border. So I'm pretty sure, and as we will see today, scholars that start from an interest in migration, or scholars that start from an interest in security, or start from an interest in surveillance, we all arrive at the same topics, at the same kinds of discussions. But I specifically want to focus on the border. I want to understand how a border works as a political entity, but also because the border, of course, is itself a conceptual entity. What does it do? It's not only an empirical thing that we study. Between the concepts we use, between the ideas we develop, also all kinds of boundaries arise and are rewritten. And I'm specifically interested in the interaction between, let's say, the conceptual and the empirical. And the main concept, as the title of the book already indicates, is that I develop is border as infrastructure. What do I mean with that? Well, the reason I call a border an infrastructure is to make the argument that borders are not just things that block circulation within an existing infrastructure know that a border can be seen as an infrastructure itself. It's not something that intervenes in infrastructure to direct or redirect migrants or to select them. It does so, of course, but then you can study the border itself as a kind of infrastructure. Because it is multiple, because it's almost everywhere, and because it connects so many things. And if you look in the development of the literature of the past couple of decades, I think it started maybe in the 1990s, the early 2000s, with an interest in metaphors of a fortress and walls. Walls have not disappeared, of course, later on surveillance, but I think the notion of infrastructure is I won't say a better way, but a new way of trying to include all these perspectives. And as we will see, I think in all the books today, borders not just block circulation or redirect it, they also act as selection mechanisms. It was an argument already developed in the work with Evelien and Albert years ago. They not just stop circulation, but they redirect it and select between different forms of migrants, different forms of refugees, and different forms of money and goods as well. So in the book, you will see many examples of the relationship between humans and technology, and many examples of borders. I was in the lucky circumstance that I was in contact with Henk Wilschut, a photographer, who wrote beautiful books on Ville de Calais, and also last 2 years ago on the gardens that migrants make in refugee camps. The New Yorker dedicated a very long article on his work. And he offered me to have a look in his archive, because for many Dutch magazines, he acted as a photographer during what we do not call the migration crisis in 2015, 2016. And I could make a selection of his pictures, and they are used throughout the book as chapter openings. They don't really tell the story of the book by a visualization, but they are kind of a narrative itself. So here you see examples of surveillance in Bulgaria, a watchtower in Bulgaria, train station in Hungary, and a fence on a rail track in Hungary as well. And of course, the notion of an infrastructure should not be understood in sheer isolation. An infrastructure relates to movement, relates to circulation. And to return to the point I made in the beginning, namely of the double meaning of a border, both empirically and as well as conceptually, via this research on borders, I'm interested in notions of concepts and how concepts travel. So my idea is that, especially in Europe, but actually also worldwide, but especially in Europe, where we have the unique political entity of the European Union, we see that via the way borders are created and border control is executed, not just law enforcement travels, but also notions of authority, of sovereignty, of jurisdiction travel, and are transformed. So there again, I'm interested in the relationship between concepts, ideas, very strong, powerful political concepts, and the material shape they take. And I think borders are an excellent point of departure to study that process. The notion of infrastructures also allows me to relate border structures to all kinds of other infrastructures. Not just various forms of physical borders, wall fences, or various data systems relating to it, but also labor migration infrastructures, deportation infrastructures, data infrastructures, knowledge infrastructures, corporate infrastructures, security infrastructures, and so on and so forth. And in the book, I define 4 characteristics of borders as infrastructure, which I work with. And I think they're applicable to other infrastructures as well. First, they connect large-scale networks with local situations. Secondly, they select between migrants and travelers in very particular ways. Third, they can be visual or invisible, or visible and invisible at the same time. And borders themselves, finally, are often themselves movable entities that sometimes travel with migrants. And one of the key notions I develop in the book to understand this traveling of concepts is the notion of an infrastructural compromise. And an example I tend to use to explain what I mean with a compromise is that of a wildlife crossing, an ecoduct, as we call it in the Netherlands. A wildlife crossing tries to combine the circulation of wildlife with the mobility, the traffic, the economic structure of human mobility. So it tries to combine both via an invention. It creates something new, something that was not there before. Something emerges. And I think this is a good metaphor for what borders do. Out of the connection between different political imperatives, economic imperatives, something new arises. And in the book, I describe various examples of these compromises. For instance, like exactly what Miria described in her presentation, the combination of humanitarianism with security is a kind of a compromise. But I must add immediately, often this results in very compromised compromises. And so is, for instance, the combination of security and service at Schiphol Airport, where some travelers can easily, smoothly go through all the gates, whereas others are stopped. And finally, on the conceptual level, I'm interested in what technopolitics means. Of course, the relationship between politics and technology comes in many forms. We all know, I guess, the famous text by Langdon Winner with the question, do artifacts have politics? It's a classical text in science and technology studies in which he studies the design of the urban designer and architect Robert Moses in the 1930s in New York, where he developed these overpasses towards Long Island. But they were constructed in such a way that it didn't allow public transportation to go through. And that excluded, of course, the African American community and only let the ones who had a car reach the islands. Now, I immediately must add that the text itself, the analysis is debatable. It's questionable whether historically it's entirely right, to what extent Moses was a racist or not, and what kind of racism was involved there. Most certainly there was a form of exclusion going on, whether it was intentional or unintentional is still a matter of debate. But interesting enough, when you look in all kinds of textbooks, this text appears and reappears over and over again. So apparently the argument, whether it's correct or not, is still very telling. And here you see it also at work, in the work of Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism and Rua Benjamin, where they repeat the question whether artifacts of politics in the context of algorithmic bias, racism, and discrimination. So to me, this means that this question of technopolitics apparently is it's important for very physical circumstances, the overpasses, algorithmic circumstances. And what I'm interested in this book is the relations between them. It will not come as a surprise that I'm also using the notion of mediation quite a lot throughout the work. So what I try to study is not only the relationship between digital and material forms of technopolitics. I'm also interested in the transformation between different forms of politics. So sometimes technopolitics comes in a very instrumental way, when technology is used as a means to an end. Whether it works or not, doesn't mean that it works, but it is intended as a means to an end. In other circumstances, like more Foucauldian or Latourian analysis of governmentality or assemblatures or arrangements, we see technopolitics in the form of networks, of socio-technical translations that take place. But finally, I think technopolitics sometimes also occurs in the sense of a kind of a worldview, an image politicians or people have, or sometimes an image does not have to be carried by individuals, of course, it's just there as a shared imagination. And when, for instance, Europe's border politics are seen as a kind of machinery with which you can work, I think the technology, the technopolitics, takes the shape of an imagination of a certain worldview. And what I try to do in the book is see the relations, the movement between these different forms of technopolitics. And I'm, of course, not the first one to work on the relation between technology and politics. Many examples in the literature, but I think for this book, with my focus on infrastructures and movements, especially the notion of via politics developed by William Walters and the one on Kinopolitics by Thomas Neal are of particular importance. So let's, in the remaining time, quickly run through the book. How does this argument develop, and what kind of research did I do? Well, the book starts with a chapter on the border as vehicle, in which I set out the main arguments and try to describe how a border is something that emerges. And I use examples from migrants traveling from Ventimiglia to Calais, for instance. In the second part of the book, second chapter, I take a more historical perspective, and I describe, starting with actually the negotiations and the agreements leading to the Schengen Agreement in the 1980s, before the fall of the wall already. I try to study the simultaneous interaction between the rise of border control agencies, most notably Frontex, the rise of digital borders and all the data systems involved there, Eurodac, the Schengen Information System, the Visa Information System, and the interoperability between them. And thirdly, the technological dimension of external dimension, the technological dimension of the externalization of border control, for instance, to Eastern Europe or to Northern Africa. And the point I try to make there is that the invention of Schengen, this distinction between the outer border with a common responsibility for the nation states and the space of free movement in between the Schengen countries, was presented as a kind of laboratory, because the Schengen Agreement was developed outside the more regular European institutions. But the laboratory comes with a very dangerous connotation. It can explode as well. It was also an experiment with fundamental rights. The third chapter of the book is the most theoretical one. In that chapter, I try to read the Spheres trilogy by Peter Sloterdijk via Latour's actor network theory. So don't simply compare them. I take the actor network theory as a lens to understand the Spheres trilogy. And I'm well aware that it's a bit tricky to use Peter Sloterdijk's work here. He's a very contested author, and I would be very wary to use his more organicists metaphors about nation states and circulation. But what I do learn from him, especially in the Spheres trilogy, is this radical interest in the material shape. It's a kind of material metaphysics he develops. And his focus on immanence, how politics, how ideas develop from the inside out. And using the work of Latour helps me to understand the circulation between the material and the movement. Before I turn to Schiphol International Airport and study the interaction, but also the compromises between design, detection, and detention that takes place. And in chapter 5, I present the field work I did on the Greek Aegean Islands during the so-called migration crisis on the islands of Chios and Lesbos in 2015 and 2016. Chapter 5 mainly focuses on the development of the so-called Eurosur program and the relation to the hotspot approach, all in the context of the Dublin regulation. And chapter 6 mainly looks into the humanitarian border. It tries to open up to understand the circulation, the emergence of a humanitarian border by focusing not just on the arrival and the interaction between NGOs, solidarity workers, medical staff, teachers, but also on the movements of all kinds of materials that took place, food, shelter, and so on and so forth. And in chapter 7, I pay specific attention to the visual infrastructure and the way it is used, how sometimes even the same kind of images or related images, maps, graphs, information, photographs are used for purposes of counter-surveillance, of counter-mapping, and the visualization of border deaths. I think we're all familiar with these examples. The lists, of course, that indicates the people that died while trying to reach the European mainland. The maps that are made to give it a geographical connotation. Sometimes these maps are related to timelines so that you can see, well, in a very loose way, the relation between different European policies and the amount of border deaths. Some maps are even interactive, where you can also report severe dramas happening on the Mediterranean. And this leads me to the final chapter, chapter 8, in which I develop the idea of what I call paramorphic politics, a specific kind of politics that is involved with the border, that not just focuses on the border, but has the consequence that it pushes everything to the limits. One of the ideas I developed in the book is that borders are almost in Europe. They almost operate as an infectious disease. They're contagious. Everything can be turned into a border, and with that, it's easy to. Well, it's not easy. It is possible that the border as an infrastructure is a very extreme infrastructure. It always goes to the limits and can be easily out of control. So I think there's a specific technopolitics at work in the border as infrastructure, and I hope this will inspire you and helps you to think and work with borders. And I also hope that, well, maybe there's place for that in the discussion, that we can continue working on borders and studying borders, perhaps not only in relation to human mobility, but also in the Anthropocene to more ecological or health surveillance kind of issues that take place, because borders have many functions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Huub, also for staying well within the time frame. Let's now open the floor for the two responses which we have invited for Huub's presentation. The first of which will be Mirja Georgiou, Professor of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics.
Thank you. I was very pleased and thankful when I was asked to offer this response, and then I got really stressed and I found out that this is an impossible task, because this is such a rich book that makes my task quite difficult. So I'm going to offer a very partial response that misses a lot out of the wonderful ideas and provocations in the book, so you have to go and buy the book to make sure that you have a full cover. But I thought that even though I'm well aware that whatever I say will be so partial, I thought that the first sentence of the book captures something that I could not, and I have never seen such a wonderful way to frame a book. Although the term border expresses delimitation and demarcation, it remains a concept with few limits. I thought that this sentence really captures the spirit of the book, and it's Huub's attempt to offer that holistic approach to the way that the border works as a system, as a network that brings together spaces, technologies, and different actors. So the book offers an intellectually provocative approach to the border through that lens of an infrastructural read to the border. And it does so poetically, but also critically. The primary conceptual starting point is that of infrastructure, but this is, I think, also a book that speaks very much to different disciplinary debates that take place around borders. We have seen snapshots of the ways that Huub works around different conceptualizations of border, power, and infrastructures. And the book is full of powerful metaphors, such as the border as mobile infrastructures, border as vehicles for politics, borders as laboratories. And these metaphors work on different levels and in fact provide much more than an inviting language of engagement with scholarly work, but they become commanding entry points that conceptually, empirically, and analytically guide us through the border. The author works through these metaphors to outline the morphology of borders as more than instruments of politics done somewhere else, as he says. But instead, and importantly, he explains to us how borders create technopolitical maneuvering spaces and become political vehicles in themselves, as he writes, containing, within, quote, within themselves, implicit and explicit political goals, generating unforeseen consequences and encouraging political intervention. So the metaphors that drive many of the book's discussions then do not only work to explain to us how the border works as a network of actors, technologies, and meanings, but also in themselves form a conceptual network that is both holistic and dynamic in its theorization of border as infrastructure that I found extremely thought-provoking. And taking, of course, the limitations of time, and I know I will run over and Kuhn will be unhappy, but I want to focus on one of those specific metaphors, which I found very thought-provocative, that of the laboratory. So, as he writes, the border has become Europe's infrastructural laboratory. The idea of the laboratory, he explains, has two distinct meanings. First, as it works as a metaphor of the laboratory. So we can understand any kind of laboratory infrastructure as involving different actors who work together or next to each other in networks to set and execute tasks. And in fact, the border is precisely that, he explains throughout the book. A network of actors, human and non-human, that converge in what I read as non-isomorphic, small and large-scale constellations, or, as he puts it, vehicles of power, control, organization, coordination, and technology. And there is no doubt, I think, for me as a reader, that thinking of the networked character of the border is one of the main contributions of this book. This is a book that conceptually and empirically unravels through its pages the border as anything but a set point in the map. And this also raises for me my initial question, especially because of Huub's infrastructural take. If the border is a network, and as a scholar of infrastructure, how can we identify the inevitable fragilities, breaks, and faults in that network or infrastructure? Second, the second point about thinking about border as a laboratory in the book is that it invites us to understand the border as laboratory that captures Europe's reconfiguration of security and technology beyond the existing institutional norms, what perhaps is already known and established. Thinking of the border as laboratory for European authorities that is no less than a reflection of the fascination of those in power with the new, with the digital, with data, but also of conceptions of limited new possibilities for innovative bordering technologies that can govern territories and people's lives. Perhaps, and I would add, and this is also part of my reading, not sure if this is also the intention of the author, that that conception and imagining of the border as laboratory by those on power allows for the emergence of a space where accountability is very difficult to monitor. So, because after all, the opaque and always changing digital infrastructures and the laboratory cultures of constant innovation and experimentation makes it very difficult for democratic and elected institutional actors to keep up and to check what is going on. Any laboratory, after all, any laboratory's raison d'etre is to work as a meaningful system through trial and error. The border within the book, conceptually and empirically, becomes an infrastructural and moral and political space of testing, experimenting, trialing. Only, of course, as we know, it does so with human lives, dignity, and future at its stake. So the reason I focus among the many, many contributions of the book on the idea of the border as laboratory is because of this most striking way the metaphor and conceptual provocation of the laboratory works to remind us of some of the most fundamental, of one perhaps of the most fundamental questions in regards to the border and its technologies. If the border becomes a laboratory, I ask, and humans its subjects of testing, what and how can we address those critical and urgent ethico-political questions that the border presents to us? And put it otherwise, if the border presents a growing and an all-encompassing regime of power over human lives, what is to be done, as Lenin would say? So one of the sub-questions under the what is it to be done is that question of historicity, and I would be interested to hear a bit more. Is there, and I would like to hear a bit more about how you think about the history of the border, because very much you focus on its presence. Is there anything to learn about history, about how we deal with the border at present and future? And then in relation to what is to be done, you also write something that intrigued me. And you write, if there were no state borders, other kinds of borders would emerge in different shapes at other locations. So is there any possibility for a normative articulation of our critique with a vision of another world, which is a similar question that Sandra, that difficult question that you threw to me? A world that, if not without borders, can it be less brutal and less unfair in terms of mobility injustices? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirja. Can we invite Albert Meijer on the stage, who is a full professor of public innovation at Utrecht University and chair of the public management group, and a well-known expert in public administration in an information age, with a series of publications on public innovation, smart cities, ICT data, and social media in the public sector. And of course, also this exceptional occasion to return to the 2011 Migration Machine book here and to have this discussion here. So Albert, the floor is yours. Let me change the slide to the other slide we had prepared.
Yeah, thank you, Koen, for this very nice introduction, and thanks for the invitation to respond to Huub's excellent book here and returning to old networks in Latourian terms and to old discussions that we can continue from here. And I'm very pleased to be here and to engage in this discussion. As Koen indicated, I'm a scholar of public administration, so my perspective may be a little bit different from people that come from media studies or from science and technology studies, but I think it complements very well, and I think the topic is so important that we need sort of the interdisciplinary focus as already has been expressed before. It's been very nice to see that 10 years ago we used the metaphor of the machine. It now has evolved to the metaphor of the infrastructure, which is even broader and more encompassing, and I think fits even better what's going on at a very, very large scale. I read the book with great pleasure. It's very well written. It presents a lot of interesting, rich insights into these practices, into these socio-technical practices. In his presentation, Huub did not refer to Sloterdijk's work, probably to keep it simple for simple people like me. But I learned a bit about Sloterdijk's work, which I find very, very difficult to grasp. But I think the way you present it and you connect his work on spheres to what's happening in these border infrastructures that are connected to the European project is also really interesting to read. And what I also found very interesting is that you clearly make the point that the border tells us something not only about socio-technical projects, but also about the European project and what the European project is, what it means. And I must say that for me, that was also quite an eye-opening insight to read more about that. What I also quite enjoyed, and that's something that we discussed also in our previous collaboration, the connection to artistic expressions, and you refer to the photos, but you also refer to literature, to Paul Auster, to Dostoevsky. So you use the literature also to come to a deeper understanding of borders as infrastructures, which I think is also a very rich way to do it and nice to read. So I read the book with great pleasure, but there are also some things that, well, there are also always things that are missing. You have to make choices, which can sort of form the agenda for further research. But I think they're also quite fundamental in understanding what's going on. And I actually had 5 points, but maybe in view of time, I'll limit it to the 3 main ones that I would like to discuss here. And the 3 main ones are actually the human side of developing technology, the role of democracy, and the third one is the normative perspective on borders. And the third one connects well to what Sandra said before and Miriam followed up on, but I think my perspective will be a little bit different. So let me start with the first one, the human side. Well, what I find quite interesting actually, but also a limitation, is that the whole focus on who these people are that construct these borders, that develop information systems, that make the connections. I mean, there is some description of the people at the borders themselves, but the ones developing the technology are largely absent from the book. And you refer to quite a bit of Latour's work, but maybe not so much to his original work on Science in Action, where he clearly makes the point that that in the end we have to understand how technology is being constructed, shaped by human actors in cultural context and institutional context, but we need to have a better understanding of who these people are. And at the moment I lead a project on algorithms in the police, and we also study who these tech developers are that developing these algorithms, what kind of values they work with, what kind of instructions they have, how they collectively construct social norms. So I think for a next step in understanding these borders as infrastructures would not only be sort of the outside perspective, but actually really in line with Latour, opening the black box and trying to understand who the people are that are constructing these borders as infrastructures. So that's the first point. The second one is democracy. And well, yeah, this is a bit of a nasty comment, but I checked whether democracy was in the index, but it was not, which does not mean democracy is not being discussed, but it certainly doesn't have the position that politics have. So you focus mainly on politics and the conception of politics, which is important and enlightening, especially in the connection with Latour's work and Sloterdijk's work. But your own thesis, your PhD thesis, was about Dewey, and who is a very old friend of yours, I know, but he's totally absent from this work, which I actually find quite an important limitation, because Dewey helps us to understand how we can develop process of societal learning in an institutional context around these large technological developments. And I'm involved in an NWA project on democratic innovation redress, where we try to discuss new forms of deliberative and plebiscitary democracy and see what their potential is for wicked and difficult issues, similar to the process that they had in Ireland around the abortion legislation. And I think, and you refer to Latour's work on the conference, or Sloterdijk's work on the conference, and Latour's work on the Parliament of Things. So there are some indications, but these these are not fully developed in the book yet, whereas I think connecting these basic notions from Latour and Sloterdijk and connecting them to broader discussions about citizen panels, David van Rijbroek's idea about working with lottery as a form to innovate democratic processes, I think would be quite interesting, because I fear otherwise we develop this very critical perspective of borders as techno infrastructures, which also make us rather helpless, in the sense that's what I sort of feel in the book. It's, yeah, what can I do about it? It's this huge socio-technical project that affects me, and if I'm a migrant, in many different ways. But it's these spheres and politics that are sort of escape my own agency. Whereas I think if we would be able to connect it to Dewey, to notions about democratic innovations, maybe the notion of a citizen panel about European borders, then we would sort of bring back human agency and human democratic agency into the debate, and would not be sort of this huge project that we can only understand and criticize, but it could be a project where we can start thinking about what direction would be desirable. And a third point, and that sort of follows up on the second point, that connects to what Sandra and Miriam said before, is what do we want with these borders? Because there's sort of this feeling of unease in, when certainly in progressive circles, where on the one hand there's the whole discourse about globalization and no borders, and at the same time, and that's also I think what Sandra refers to, the idea of having a welfare state where there are certain mechanisms to ensure that people that are in poor conditions can also can receive assistance and can be taken care of. So yeah, as again it was touched upon before, but I would also be very interested in, can we sort of develop also a progressive perspective on borders, because I wouldn't go as far to only criticize them, but I think, well, at least that would be my question to you. Can there also be a progressive perspective on borders, where we feel that they do not only extend inequalities and lead to new forms of racialization, inequality, but where they can also help to create a certain type of compartmentalization in the world that may be beneficial? And I mean, it's very much connected also to current debates that we're having, of course, about sort of bringing back production to Europe, reducing global dependencies related to the war in Ukraine, of course. So does that mean that we're sort of leaving this project of globalization, and that we're sort of redeveloping a new vision on borders as useful forms of compartmentalization in this complex world? And I think that would be sort of a very important question to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you would like to respond to those responses, and then we'll see if there are also questions here in the room. Ira, would you like to pose your question now? You can, and maybe we can see if we can pick it up, but if you can introduce yourself, and then maybe we can. Sure, yeah.
So I'm from Mexico, and my first encounter with borders was Trump's attempt to build a wall. And I think that since then, borders, especially physical borders, have been in my mind. And then I would like to have your opinion on two specific questions I have. And the first one would be, what do physical borders stand for symbolically for the world where the information and threats of keep on acting and existing virtually? And then the second question that I have is, what does the eagerness of these invisible borders say about the authority and sovereignty of the nation? And maybe if you have some things to those questions, how invisible borders stand in our world with media and virtual information. And yeah, very much.
Thanks so much, Jiraya. Would you like to come up to the stage again?
Well, thank you very much, Miria and Albert. That was great. I feel flattered by your comments and the way you managed to read this book so carefully, but also to point to some, formulate some questions and point to some really important issues, and to give me an agenda and outline for the next book I have to write. So thanks for that. Let's make it a joint project. Maybe that would work well. Yeah, I'll. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer to all the questions. I will try to grab some together, and then I'm sure in the rest of the day we can continue the conversation. Well, let's start with Miria's question about the fragility of borders. Now, indeed, it's I'm sure you all agree with that. It's not my intention to picture borders as a homogeneous force of power. It's a bricolage of which fragility is always a part. And indeed, I think that fragility would even be more visible if you would do a ethnographic analysis of how border systems are developed from the inside out. Albert, you mentioned Latour's Science and Actions, but actually his first book, Laboratory Life, would be really applicable to this. Open up the black box of a border, and then indeed you would also the fragility of these border networks would become more visible, because interoperability always means very fragile, very temporary connections between all kinds of systems, all kinds of failures, all kinds of testing that goes wrong. So I fully agree that they are fragile. An interesting question there, of course, is what does that fragility mean? On the one hand, it can be seen as a weakness. We're not there yet. But on the other hand, of course, this fragility makes borders flexible, because circumstances can change. Who knows? Turkey becomes part of the European Union. Who knows? Ukraine becomes associated member. Who knows? And I'll continue with that. Our entire view, because our society is aging and we need more labor forces. We're going to give up the entire difference between refugees and migrants. So then the fragility perhaps is also an opportunity for the policymakers to redirect these border systems. The second point, I think, about the accountability, the difficulty of monitoring borders, relates really well to Albert's question about democracy. Yeah, oops, not in the book. And deliberately so, of course, because of course in a normal book democracy would play a role. So why did I leave the notion of democracy out deliberately? Well, I agree that from all kinds of perspectives, when you open up the border laboratory, you could also dive deeper. Another chapter adds about the decision-making processes, the negotiations that take place, would fit perfectly well. But the reason I'm hesitant about the notion of democracy is that it often brings with a specific view on decision-making, as if decision-making can treat borders as an object. You can separate between the human decision-making process, the democratic process on the one hand, and the machinery on the other hand. I'm sure that's not what you have in mind. I'm sure that would be debatable from your perspective as well, Albert. But the thing I try to develop, the view I try to develop, also with the work of Peter Sloterdijk, is to show that perhaps democratic decision-making is not something that decides about borders, but is already part of a larger project, part of this European project, in which thinking about borders very much steers the way we envision the European Union. So I would like to contest some existing notions of democratic decision-making about borders. Yeah, then the laboratory notion and the historicity. That's a really important point, and I think that also points to the question both Sandra previously, Albert, and you mentioned. What's to be done? Or what do we want? What's the future of borders? Is there any future? I think their history is really important, and increasingly historical research on 19th century migration, for instance, makes clear once again that it's important to, although I focus on Europe in this book, that we have to provincialize Europe. The nation state or the border is not the gift from Westphalia to the world. It's not, we often think that the notion of the nation state developed the border because it's developed the idea of a combination of sovereignty and territory, and from there it spread all over the world, and it was invented in Europe. Well, contemporary historians point out, well, that was not the case. Borders come in many ways. The border never was this really clear defining line. You had to distinguish between borders for traveling, borders for economic traffic, for financial traffic, and it did not only arise in the West. There were all kinds of borders everywhere already, and all kinds of political entities already. So what this historical research also shows is that over the past 150 years, migration has also always been a process of negotiation between the states where migrants are arriving from and the countries where they go to. All kinds of, especially in the process of decolonization, of course. Many legislation had to be made, and many legislation still stems from there to guide the process of decolonization and the return of people from the former colonies. So I think what's important to learn from that is that we do not see Europe as the agent that is in charge of its own borders. That Europe has to be repositioned in a geopolitical world, and we have to see, I think, a longer term perspective where these borders are always also part of geopolitical agreements. And if we do that, I think we broaden our spectrum. We don't have to focus, as what is the warning of my book, to push the border to the limits and to create an extreme infrastructure. Because if you look from a global perspective, I think that paves the roads to other perspectives as well. So what do we do about borders? Yeah, the point I make in the book is that the argument by mobility scholars is often that we shouldn't talk about migration because migration only exists in a world with nation states and with borders. Instead, we should talk about human mobility and leave the whole idea of a nation state and the border behind. Well, apart from the question whether that's a realistic point of view, I tend to think that indeed if one border disappears, another will reappear all of a sudden by housing prices, labor markets, whatever. But I think if, again, we return to this more global perspective and look into Europe from the inside out with our aging societies, with all the pressure that will be on the labor market, I think Europe will be forced to change things in the future. And of course, it will be very opportunistic, will be very cynical as well. Already, of course, the nation states develop their programs to select between different kinds of refugees. Yeah? Politicians saying, well, send us the dentists first from Syria, and then we take it from there. So it's an awful and very ugly process. But maybe the only optimistic thing there to see is that the world will get more connected in that respect as well. Let's see, did I answer most of the questions? I think the fragility, the laboratory partly, the Lenin question, the future, and Albert's the human side of technology, the democracy, and the normative perspective. I think it was all in there. Maybe your final question. Yeah, the border wall. In the literature, the point that's often made, of course, is that border walls are typically part of what's been seen as the border theater, to create a sphere in which you visualize that there is a state and that something is done. But I think the most important point we learned from all the research on migration is that not walls are the most important borders, but the visa regime, the passport, the country you come from, that's on a global scale, I think, is the most important border still that we have. Well, I hope this leads to more discussions and to a new book. Thank you very much.